Your child is technically excellent in training. Game day comes, ball arrives under pressure, and they freeze or panic. That's not a confidence problem. That is a design problem, and it is entirely fixable. If you found the first video in this series first, this one picks up where that one left off. And if this is where you're starting from, you're in the right place as well. By the end of this video, you'll watch your child's next match differently. And I mean that specifically. Let's get into it. I want you to think about football performance as a two-gear system. The C gear is the perceptual system, the player's capacity to read what the environment is offering. So where are the opponents? Where's the space? Where's the ball going? And the player who arrives late to the ball doesn't fail to compute this. They fail to find it early enough because their practice environment never trained them to look for it in the first place. The do gear is the movement system, so receiving the ball, passing it, dribbling, shooting, running around, the physical execution of the decision the brain just made. Here's that critical point that almost all drill-based training misses entirely. The two gears are coupled, they are not separable. You can't train the do gear in isolation and then attach it to the C gear when match day arrives. The reason is perception action coupling. So it's a principle from motor learning science that says the way the brain learns movements is inseparable from the informational context in which these movements occur. So when you are practicing passing with a clean, predictable ball from a static position to a stationary target, you're training a very specific perception action coupling. This ball with a static context equals this kind of pass. That coupling isn't there in the match because the perceptual context, moving opponents, changing angles, pressure, the noise, it's not there in practice. The match isn't offering what practice prepared the player to read. The perceptual information is different. The movement solutions the player has developed don't have a signal to attach to, and that's when we might see them freeze up. Here's what surprised me the most when I first read the research on this. You might assume, as I did, that the solution is more repetitions in training, practice a pass 1,000 times until the movement becomes automatic, regardless of context. That doesn't appear to be accurate though. More repetitions in the same context don't transfer. They make a player better at that specific context. So more cone drills don't produce more game readiness. They produce more cone drill proficiency. Instead, the solution is change the perceptual context of the practice. So make practice look like the match. Train the C gear and the do gear together because in a match they are never operating separately. And that's why practice games are not just warm up activities, they are the most important thing on the training menu. They are specifically training that resembles the match the most, both in the amount of information that there is and the requirement for decision making under pressure. And lucky for us, those 165 hours a week outside of club training, they might not just be supplementary to your kid's development. It can also be where real development happens if those hours are designed right. And I'll go through the principles again, but if you need help implementing these principles, you can check out the link to the Backyard Lab. I want to spend some time on scanning because I think it's one of the most concrete, most observable expressions of the C gear. And the research here is quite interesting, really. Geir Rure, a Norwegian sports scientist at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, my alma mater, and his PhD student at the time, Karl Marius Axiom, have spent time studying eye movements and awareness in elite football players. Their research has involved tracking exactly what players did with their eyes in the seconds before receiving a ball. And what they've found is that elite players, specifically the best central midfielders in European football, scan the pitch on average zero point 0.8 to 1.2 times per second in the time up to receiving a ball. And it's not just looking around at random. These are deliberate, systematic information gathering in the moments before the ball arrives. Those numbers are for elite midfielders, but average professional players scan around 0.4 to 0.6 times per second in the seconds leading up to them receiving the ball. For youth players in typical what we call high-level academies, this number is significantly lower. What's happening in those seconds before the ball arrives is reading the game. The elite midfielder is not making decisions when the ball reaches them. They made the decision 2, 3, 4 seconds ago. The touch is the output of a decision-making process that already happened. When an average or developing player receives the ball with their head down, looks up, processes who is around them, then decides what to do, they're making that decision under pressure in real time with opponents closing in. That's really hard to do. And it's slow. And that's the exact point in time when we might observe them seemingly freeze or panic. The elite player, on the other hand, already knows what to do. They've looked up 4 seconds ago. When the ball arrives, their first touch is already going to the space they've identified 2 seconds before the ball got there. Here is the implication for you as a parent. When you watch your child play and you think they don't look up enough, you're not wrong. But the reason they don't look up isn't necessarily because they lack awareness or intelligence. The reason might just be that they don't look up because they've never been in a practiced environment that demanded it. Cone drills don't require scanning. The drill is predictable, the information is fixed. There's no point in scanning the environment because the environment never changes. So the child's brain doesn't develop the habit of scanning because it's never been rewarded for it. Practice games with quick transitions, multiple goals perhaps. There might be numerical mismatches with varying rules and rewards. They demand scanning. The environment is always changing, and the kids, they have to keep looking because the picture keeps changing. Repetition of that habit over time builds the scanning skill. It's not really something you can instruct effectively. Look up more as a command tells the child what to do, not why the information is valuable. It doesn't build the skill. The game builds it because the game gives the player a reason to look. The environment builds the reward pathway, and you can build the environment. What a well-designed practice game does is create genuine perceptual demand. The child can't rely on a rehearsed response. They have to look, they have to process, they have to decide, because the game has stakes. Their team loses if they don't. The motivation to scan correctly is intrinsic. You don't need to reward them for looking up. Looking up gets rewarded by the game itself. It makes them play better, makes them score more goals, makes them better defenders. That's the gardener at work. You're designing an environment where the right behavior is self-reinforcing. This insight into motor learning science comes from a Soviet physiologist named Nikolai Bernstein, who did lots of work in this area from the 1920s onwards. So it's not exactly a new concept. But what Bernstein did was he studied blacksmiths, professional blacksmiths who swung hammers for a living, 10,000, 20,000 repetitions, same swing over and over. They were expert blacksmiths. The assumption at the time, and the assumption that still dominates most coaching philosophy, was that through repetition, movement becomes fixed. The expert has done it so many times that the movement is grooved in it's automatic, it's a program. Bernstein actually found the opposite. When he measured the exact trajectories of the hammer swings, not just the endpoint, but the path of the hammer through space, what he found was that every single swing was different. The expert blacksmiths were never repeating exactly the same movement, so each swing was a slightly different solution to the same problem. The end result, the hammer striking the target, was really, really consistent, but the path to get there varied constantly. He called it repetition without repetition, and it completely changed the science of motor learning. What Bernstein discovered was that the goal of practice is not to groove a single fixed movement. The goal of practice is to solve a problem enough times in enough different ways that the player in this case develops flexible, adaptive solutions, not a single fixed answer. This is why the best practice environments are not the cleanest or the most controlled ones. The best practice environments are genuinely varied, challenging, and predictable. The ball that might bounce awkwardly, a game where the rules change halfway through, a backyard session against a sibling who doesn't cooperate and plays differently every time, the scrappy kick around on an even surface with weird goals. That's not inferior to structured drilling. It's the environment that builds what Bernstein described: flexible solutions, not fixed programs. The variation itself isn't the goal. The goal is to build adaptable players. So a child who has played 1,000 messy games has encountered the same problem in 1,000 slightly different forms and built flexible movement solutions to match. And when Saturday arrives, the game presents something unexpected. They find something close enough. They have experiences to draw on. A child who has only drilled a clean version has one perfect response. But when the clean version doesn't solve the problem, it rarely does in a match. They have nothing. A quick point about the value of an organized play here, because I think it's one of the most consistently undervalued things in modern youth development. Research on elite athlete development across multiple sports consistently finds that the players who reach the top did not spend their childhood in structured training alone. They played freely without adults directing the sessions, getting in the way. They invented games themselves. They made the rules up and they changed the conditions in which they played and practiced. That free, child directed play is not wasted time. It's precisely the environment that Bernstein's insight points to: variable, self directed, full of novel problems that need flexible solutions. Your backyard, your driveway, your local park, these are not necessarily inferior to the training ground. With the right environmental design, they can produce the kind of practice that transfers to the match. In part 3, the next video in this series, I'll give you the specific framework for doing just that. The Soccer Parenting Association surveyed 965 soccer parents in 2025. I want to quote you something from their headline findings. They identified a phenomenon they call the shadow curriculum, and they described it like this. Parents feel a developmental anxiety and look to the club to provide the specific homework necessary to alleviate it. So parents are asking their clubs, what should my child be working on at home? Give me specific things. Tell me how to use the 165 hours a week that the team practice doesn't touch. The clubs, with a handful of exceptions, can't answer that question, and it's not really their fault. It's a structural limitation. The club optimizes for 2 or 3 hours of team practice it controls. The other 165 hours are not their domain. But those 165 hours are a huge opportunity. Think about it this way. Your child might attend club practice 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week. Let's call it 3 hours on average of actual organized football per week. Over the course of a year, that's roughly 150 hours, give or take. Now, consider your child is also awake for something like 112 hours a week. Of those 112 hours, 3 to 5 are at club practice. The other 109 or so are somewhere else. What happens in those hours shapes the player, not just because of football specific practice that might happen there, but because of everything that feeds into athletic development. Sleep, nutrition, psychological load, social connection, unorganized play across multiple contexts. The club will never own those 165 hours. You will. The question that you, as a parent, might be sitting with, and which this short series is building toward answering, is what do you do with those hours? Because right now, in most families, those 165 hours contains a mixture of maybe some private coaching, some YouTube tutorials, some repetitive wall work or cone setups in the driveway, and a significant amount of passively doing nothing. And none of that, not the private coaching, not the cone setups, not the YouTube tutorials, is doing what you think it's doing. The private coaching, if it's drill based, is producing robot development, competent in controlled conditions, fragile in match conditions. The cone setups are training the wrong perceptual context. The YouTube tutorials generally involve the same thing. The context doesn't really match what we really want. What works, what actually transfers to a game on Saturday, is the kind of practice I described earlier. Varied, game like, requiring scanning, requiring decision making with real opposition and real uncertainty. The more practice looks like the game, the better the transfer from practice to the game. But you don't need a coach to design it. You don't need an expensive facility. You need a backyard or a driveway or a park, and you need to understand what kind of game to set up. That's what the Backyard Architect gives you, and in part 3 of this video series, I'll take you through the full design framework. Specifically, how to use the physical space you have, what constraints to apply, how to adjust the difficulty to keep your child in the productive learning zone. Let's shift from the neurological to the physical, because the other part of why kids break down and why the 165 hours matter physically as much as perceptually is load management. Here's the concept. Every young body has a physical bucket. This bucket represents the total capacity for the tissue, the bone, the tendons, the ligaments, the muscles, to absorb training load without breaking down and still be able to improve. The size of that bucket is influenced by several things, including genetics, the stage of their growth, previous injury history, fitness levels, sleep, nutrition, other things as well. Some kids have big buckets naturally, and some have smaller ones. You can grow the bucket over time with the right kind of progressive loading, but you can't grow it overnight, and you can't outrun its current size. Now, add 3 pipes filling the bucket. Pipe 1, sport load. This is the obvious one. Matches, training sessions, private coaching, gym work, skill sessions, all the deliberate football activity. Pipe 2, the biological load. During the growth spurt, the peak height velocity, the body is undergoing a major reorganization. Bones lengthening, tendons being stretched and stressed, the neuromuscular coordination being rewired for the new body dimensions. This biological process consumes enormous physiological resources. It's itself a form of loading on the body. A child going through a major growth spurt, who's also training at a very high intensity, is subject to two massive loads simultaneously. The research on overuse injuries in young athletes consistently identifies the growth spurt period as a very high risk window. Not because kids are pushing too hard in training necessarily, though sometimes they are, but because the biological load is already filling the bucket before the sport load even arrives. Now, take pipe 3, psychological load. It's the academic stress, it's the family stress, social conflict, anxiety. These are not separate from the physical system. The research on injury risk and training load is very clear. Psychological stressors are additive and perhaps multiplicative, that word, yeah. The physical load in terms of injury risk. A child who is under significant academic pressure, going through social difficulty or experience family stress, that child's bucket is filling faster than a child in a stable, low stress environment, even at the same physical training volume. Here's what the bucket might teach you. When the bucket overflows, that becomes an injury. But an injury is not the only bad outcome, even before the bucket overflows. When it becomes near full, a child might start to struggle. Performance suffers, motivation often drops, and they start to look like they've lost their spark. A lot of parents see the performance drop and assume the child needs more training, more sessions, work harder, try harder, push through. But what the bucket is telling you is the opposite. The bucket is telling you it's time to reduce the inflow, rest, recovery, less structured training, more sleep, more free play with no performance stakes. Let the child make real decisions about their football participation and ambitions themselves. The most common mistake I've seen, both in the clinic and on the sideline, is treating performance drops as signs of effort deficit when they are, more often than not, signs of load surplus. If your child went from looking good to looking dull in 2 or 3 weeks and nothing technically changed in their coaching environment, you might ask yourself, what happened to the 3 pipes? Did the sport load increase? Are they in a growth spurt? Are they eating enough? Are they under pressure at school? Has something changed at home? The answer is very often in the bucket, not in your kid's attitude. The bucket also teaches you something about the sequencing of development. You can't expect to build perceptual skills, game intelligence, physical durability simultaneously at maximum load. The bucket has limits. And when our kids are in a biological load phase, the growth spurt, this is the time to back off on the sport load and the intensity, not the time to double down. Parents who understand this are the ones whose children are much more likely to be still playing at 20. The parents who push the hardest through the growth spurt are the ones I see most often in the clinic 3 years later. Let's get more specific about peak height velocity because I think it's one of the more practically useful concepts for any parent of a 9 to 15-year-old. Peak height velocity is the point of maximum growth rate during the adolescent growth spurt. It typically occurs between ages 11 and 14 in girls and between 13 and 16 in boys, though there is a wide individual variation here. During PHV, a child can grow 3 to 4 inches or 7 to 10 centimeters in a year. That's not just a number, that's an enormous structural reorganization happening in real time. Here is what happens physically during PHV that you as a parent and your child's coach might need to understand. Bones lengthen faster than the tendons and the muscles that attach to them. This creates increased tension on the attachment points of tendons, the exact locations where growth plate injuries like Osgood-Schlatter's disease just below the knee and Sever's disease on the heel where they occur. These are not rare. I've seen them constantly. They are a consequence of training load applied to a body that is going through growth without appropriate load management. It's also important to note that we don't really know why this happens to some and why it doesn't happen to others. So there is no reason to blame yourself if your child is going through this, but we can still be smart about it. Also, the neuromuscular system gets temporarily disrupted. The child who was coordinated and fluid at 10 may look clumsy at 13. This is real and well documented, and it's not that they're getting worse. It's a temporary recalibration as the brain rewires its new maps for the new body dimensions. The child who used to be able to land a jump cleanly has new levers, longer legs, different center of gravity, and the movement solutions, the coordination calibrated to the old body dimensions haven't yet been recalibrated for the new ones. If you are a parent watching your 12-year-old go through this, if they suddenly look less coordinated than they did at 10, that is completely normal. It could be that your kid is going through PHV, so don't panic, don't book extra training to fix the clumsiness. The clumsiness is a symptom of growth, not a training deficit. What can you do during PHV? Well, you can manage the bucket. You can reduce the sport load. You can prioritize sleep. We know growth hormone is secreted primarily during sleep, and not enough sleep during PHV is not just a performance issue, it's a structural development issue. Keep movement varied so that your child's proprioceptive system, the map of the body, gets multiple inputs across multiple contexts rather than the same load pattern over and over. Perhaps most importantly, don't use this period to push for a selection milestone. The 14-year-old who makes the regional team during PHV may be selected because they're temporarily bigger and stronger than their peers. And at that same time, they're carrying the highest injury risk of their development trajectory. If you're the parent who protects the 14-year-old during PHV, reducing load, maintain the enjoyment, keeps it multi-context, you are far more likely to have a healthy, developing 22-year-old than a parent who pushes for the regional team at 14, burns through the biological tolerance of a growing body. I want to introduce one more concept before we get into the practical design work, because it underlines things that I'll cover in part 3 of this video series. What is a chair? You might say a chair is a piece of furniture with a flat seat and 4 legs and a back, designed for sitting. Here's a different way to think about it. A chair is a sit-onable thing, not because of what it intrinsically is, but because of the relationship between the chair's properties and your body's properties. The chair is the right height for your legs. The seat is stable enough for your weight. The back provides support. For a child of 2, that same chair can be something else entirely. It might be a climbable thing, a hide behind thing, a living room castle thing, because the relationship between the chair's properties and the child's body is different. The scientific term for this relationship between an object or environment and what action it invites is an affordance. So, an affordance is an action possibility or opportunity that is created by the match between an object and an organism. So, why does this matter for your kid's football career? Because what a game affords, what actions it invites, is determined by the relationship between the game's properties and the player's properties. For instance, a small pitch affords quick combinations, close control, frequent 1-1 duels. A large pitch affords longer runs, longer passes, wide play. A pitch with small goals affords goal shooting practice and finishing. A pitch with large goals might afford better goalkeeping, crossing, shooting from distance. When you design the practice environment in your backyard, you are designing the affordances. You are deciding which actions the environment invites. And because of the perception action coupling we discussed earlier, the brain learns movements in the context of the information that produced them. The affordances you design determine what your child actually learns. A large open space with one big goal and a ball affords shooting, lots of it, and most kids will shoot. But if there's no opponent, no pressure, no decision about when to shoot versus when to pass, the shooting is happening in a context that doesn't resemble a match. The affordances, the opportunities for actions, are not the same. A small space with two goals on opposite ends, a sibling as an opponent, that affords decision making, close control, defending, quick thinking. Every time your child has the ball, there's a question, shoot, dribble, hold, recycle. The affordances demand answers. That's the game your child needs and which transfers a lot better to a real match. In part 3, I'll give you the complete practical framework, chaos ingredients, a gardener style, specific game setups, and the 5-step approach to designing the 165 hours. I want you to walk into part 3 holding this word, affordances. Every design decision we make is a decision about what the environment invites. Make the environment invite things that the match demands. I'd love to show you that it's not just me, but the science is backing this as well, that it's really good to let your child's practice look messy. The desire for clean, controlled, aesthetically tidy practice sessions is quite human. It looks like progress. It looks like skill is being developed. Kids stand in line, the ball comes, they execute the pass perfectly, the coach nods. That looks like learning. Ugly practice, chaotic, smaller sided games, messy one on ones, games where the result isn't always obvious, games where the child makes mistakes, doesn't always succeed, loses the ball, tries something that doesn't work. That looks like nothing's happening. But the research says that the ugly practice is where the learning happens. This is also called desirable difficulty in the motor learning literature. So, practice that is effortful, variable, and error prone transfers better to match conditions than practice that is smooth, predictable, and error free. The reason is what that effort demands of the player. When the game is genuinely difficult, when the environment is forcing a real answer, not a rehearsed one, what develops is a wider range of movement solutions. The player builds flexibility, not a single grooved script. Smooth, predictable practice produces smooth, predictable performance in training. doesn't transfer to the match. Practically, what this means, if your child is struggling, is making mistakes, or on the losing side on practice games against older siblings, that can be completely fine. It might be excellent practice, in fact. The goal is not for the practice to look good. The goal is for the match to look good. The gap between how practice looks and how the match looks might be smaller than most parents think. If the practice is designed right and the gap is larger than almost anyone acknowledges when the practice is drilling based, clean, coach directed. Let the practice be ugly instead. Design it right, step back and let the struggle happen. That's a gardener's patience. That's part 2. You now know what's actually happening during the freeze and why it has nothing to do with confidence or character. The see gear and the do gear, and why they can't be trained separately. What scanning looks like at the elite level, and why the practice environment is what develops it. Bernstein's insight, repetition without repetition, and why messy variable practice transfers better than these clean drills. The 165 hours, the shadow curriculum, and why your home environment matters more than most parents realize. The physical bucket and the 3 pipes of load, what peak height velocity does to the body, and affordances, how the design of the environment determines what your child learns. The next video is part 3 of this video series, and it's where I'll give you the parent framework, its specific language, what to say and what not to say on the sideline, practical take-home messages for the car ride home, how to design these 165 hours that we just talked about, and how to think about the next 10 years without sacrificing the next 10 months. Before you move on though, I've got a free tool that's called the Backyard Architect. You can tell it your child's age, the available space you have, what symptom you're seeing, if they freeze on the ball, if they're hesitant to take on players, or if they don't really look up. It can generate practice games for you that you can do in your own backyard or in the driveway, and that will train the see gear and the do gear together. There's a link below where you can find it. If you want to work with me directly, not just to watch the videos, but actually implement the information here, have me look at your child's specific situation, audit their environment, and help you design your kids' future development environment. There's a program called the Backyard Lab, links in the description below. There are limited spots, and right now there's a founding member price that will go away on May the 18th at the very latest. So if you don't join now, the price will go up. Part 3 of this 3-part series will drop in a week, so if you're watching this after that time, the link to the next video will appear right here. If you are watching this before that, thanks. You're one of the early adopters. Check back in a week's time. The next video will drop on the Wednesday after this one was released. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. See you next time.